Good morning. We're on page 417 in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, which is the source text of big part of the end of Hemshech Chaim Beis. And we finished the paragraph on top of the page 417. So to sum up what we've learned and clarify a few key points that we were in the middle of discussing. Essentially, this last paragraph is really tying together the knots of the last 12, 15 pages. First, about Torah in general, that it's an atzmi, not subject to tzimtzum. That's Torah in general. As he began discussing in page, just to lay it out here, page 402, and especially 403 and on. Torah is atzmi. Yeah. I know that's not subject to the tzimtzum. It's meaning that it comes from before the tzimtzum, and that's exactly as it manifests within existence. And of course, he asked the question on page 402, which we're going to get back to now. So what's the difference between Ner Mitzvah and Torah? Why Mitzvah is called Ner, which seems to suggest that it's not it doesn't have light without Torah. We'll get to that. Then that was the first part that went approximately to the page 400 and let me just see 409, and then 409 he went into Tosfos Bir and explained the Torah Eir, and here he added the constant difference between Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. Yosher Chezer, Mamayl Lamata, and Atzmi, the Kedusha Se'esi, the holiness of the divine in the letters of the written Torah, and as it pierces the tzimtzum, as it goes through the tzimtzum, so it's not affected by the tzimtzum ha'elyon, which what he called chashmal ha'elyon, the choshech ha'elyon. And then there's Torah Shebal Peh, which enters and immerses itself into the physical reality of our existence, of the choshech ha'tachten, the choshech down below, to create the clarity necessary and guide us with what the Torah illuminates our lives, which is the ultimate purpose, transforming the darkness to light, which in turn is rooted even higher than Torah Shebiksav, because it's going back to the Moir, the source of Torah Eir, which is the Eibush himself, the purpose of the whole Torah, which is to transform this world, as he explained at length. Okay, the Bidur Ha'achron, the Bidur Lamata. And that explains why Talmidei Chachamim are called builders of the world, because there's the building of the world based on the formula, based on the blueprint. That's the first part of the Torah. The blueprint, as he explained on page 413 and 14. But then besides the blueprint, you want to then implement. And for that, you need a new set of workers. In this context, you need the second level of Torah, Torah Shebal Peh, which is its key is the execution and a working document, a working, not just a blueprint, but something that is not just a concise blueprint, but actually you can build with by knowing every detail of halacha, to clarify every detail of halacha, to implement the Torah in this world in a real way. Okay. So the last paragraph, he said, after understanding these two aspects of the two Torah levels of Torah Eir, Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh, Yosher Chezer, all part of one Torah Eir. There's one Torah Eir, light, the Torah of light. He summed up and tied it all together by getting back to the fact that both Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal are beyond concealment. That when you bring Torah and reveal Torah, it not only is not affected by the choshech, it transforms the choshech, as he said. Yeah. And then the final piece was again about that the Torah Shebal Peh, something that Torah Shebal Ksav does not have, because it achieves that final goal, Seif Ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, that the end action, the final end of the process, is rooted all the way in the beginning of the thought. Nos tchilasa b'seif, and the beginning is wedged in the end. And here's where he brought the pasuk, which I'll just clarify here, the pasuk in Eicha. So the truth is, he brought it earlier on page 412. So the pasuk breaks into two parts, two verses. We're talking about 28, 27, and 28, 28 in the book of Iyuv, Job, not Echa, Iyuv. And what does the pasuk say? The first pasuk is where he brings, I just want to see where he says it here, Torah Shebiksav, and the two psukim referring to Torah Shebiksav is like the blueprint. Here we are. Rav Yispera Mimod B'Shalim. Yeah, Rav Yispera. That you have that he looks into the blueprint, and he enumerates all its details. That is the first pasuk. It goes like that. Let me just see where it is on that page. Hold on. Yeah,
I just posted it again.
Yeah, I think you posted already earlier, right?
Just the last pasuk, not the
right. So the first pasuk is Ozra v'Yispera Hichina v'Gam Chakra. So that says he looked and he enumerated. Let's see how they translate. Let's see how it's translated here. How it was just posted. Let's look how you just posted it. Okay, here we go. You saw engaged it. Okay, they write, V'Yispera engaged it, he measured and probed it. This is the process of writing a blueprint. Like he says there, the page of the Kav Hamida. So what does the architect do? He measures, he gauges, he evaluates every detail, like he said, every detail, what exactly that will be needed for the building and what kind of resources will be needed. But it's still in the blueprint form. So it's Torah Shebiksav. Then comes pasuk 2, the next pasuk, V'yemer la'odam, he speaks to the person now. Said to man, which clearly you see now Hashem is already speaking to the human. That means it's the human effort. When we go ahead and learn in Torah Shebal Peh, and we delve into the details, and we're now actually going to build, not just, it's not just, it's obviously completely according to the blueprint, as he's emphasized time and again. But then comes the second part, which is Vayemer la'odam, la'odam hein yiras Hashem hi chachma v'sur mana bina. So now you're talking about actualization. He's not just talking about gauging and measuring and allocating. And this is already the implementation part. And this refers to Torah Shebal Peh. It looks like that it says this in Chazal. I did not see, they just say in the pasuk here. But clearly the first pasuk is Torah Shebiksav, the second pasuk is Torah Shebal Peh. And that's what he says on page 416 that we learned. That's when he says, after he speaks about Chezer, that the mile of Torah Shebal Peh, that what? That we're not talking about the Torah Shebal Peh side. I was wondering, what's the connection? But when you look at the psukim, it's very clear. And then look at the next line. And even though, like it says in the previous verse, that he already looked in and gauged in the Torah Shebiksav, it means everything was there. The all prepared. But that's like preparing, just as an example, you prepare a meal in the kitchen, but you haven't served the meal yet, and definitely not been consumed. So everything's prepared. And this is even a higher level because it's Torah Shebiksav and it has the whole Eidei and stuff within it, and it's Vitalizes Mitzvos. Nevertheless, the Yira Tata of Torah Shebal Peh, and that's why he says the word Yira, because like the pasuk speaks about Yira Shemayim, the Yira Tata of Torah Shebal Peh, which is only Vitalizes. However, because it comes and immerses itself into the darkness and transforms the darkness into light, so as much as the blueprint is so powerful and holy, which is the written Torah, when you implement Torah in this world, and you take halacha and you clarify that this is kosher for Pesach, this is not kosher for Pesach. I'm just using a current example that achieves something even deeper because you're fulfilling the ultimate purpose of that blueprint. That's what he says. So that's what he says by Yem Elodim. That's the second half of the pasuk, and that's talking the mile of Mashiach over Moshe. And then he brings again the pasuk Vayemela Adam on top of page 417 that refers to Mashiach, because Mashiach hikim el shel Torah, which is referring to clearly Torah shebal peh. Mashiach, because as I explained yesterday, Mashiach is an implementer. Moshe gave the Torah, and then came all the years of our work, and Mashiach concludes the process. And this is also the two halves of the pasuk. Ata teir neri v'avaya yagiyah choshchi. You ata mamish ignite neri, my candle, my ner Hashem nishmas adam. That's Torah shebiksav. That's Chochmei law where Ein Sof, and the Ma be'etzem that illuminate that ignites the ner Hashem nishmas adam. Because your words sustain me or enliven me, energize me. But Chachma Tatov Torah Shebal Peh from Talmidei Chacham, that when they learn Mishnah and they learn Torah Shebal Peh, there we say Vahavaya, the Vav, the taste was Vav, like we spoke earlier, Afasisiv. That taste was Vav comes to tell us something additional, not just the Oyer but the Moyer. Sheba Mekayach Ba'Oyer HaMoyer the Ein Sof La'Giyah Choshchi, because now you want to illuminate the darkness. That's the bit of the Chesh Hagas, the thick and crass darkness of this world. That's the Klippas Nega. She'ein ze b'koyach. That's not the koyach of Chochmei law alone. That has to come down to Chochmei Tata that enters into existence. Chochmei law radiates only Chashmal Elyon, which is the higher Cheshach. Like we spoke, the higher level of the partition, the tzimtzum above. So there you have the Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh picture. And as I pointed out yesterday, if you really want to understand this even better than what we've learned here, I strongly advise learning in Ayin Beis, and I gave the pages, I'll give it again, where he speaks about this very directly. And I didn't see he makes reference, but it's very clearly within this context. So we'll talk about it more when we sum it all up in the after we finish the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So the pages that I gave were when we start about Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. Where is it? I think I said it was Aleph Shin Pei. Yeah, a little earlier. Oh, here we are. Yeah, going from page 1374 through 1386, where he elaborates. And when you learn that, you see all this is really deeply explained, very, very clearly explained, I should say. Okay. Now, conceptually, we've already learned this concept when we learned Einoid, but I've already made it clear that Einoid was from distress, the real Mamat Lamaila. That's not Torah, that's Tefillah. That comes from a person who's in a state of Mina Meitzar, in distress below, hitting rock bottom, we use the words, where the Cheshach of the Tzimtzum itself is transformed. Here we have a similar aspect to it, and he has compared it to Tshuva, but it's still within Torah. So in the context of Ayin Beis, in Torah itself, in Torah Eir itself, is two levels of Eir. There was the Cheshach itself gets transformed. Here, Eir, at the end of the day, Torah Shebal Peh is not Cheshach. Even though we say Machshakim Shivani, that the dark that is Talmud Bavli, that's because Talmud Bavli needs to clarify things. But at the end of the day, it's Torah, and Torah is an illuminator. However, it's illuminating the darkness, because Talmud Bavli goes argument and counter argument. It's not clear in the beginning, but the point is to clarify. What we learned earlier, Cheshach itself gets transformed. That's coming from the very darkness of distress. That's a different level than this. Here he's not saying it's coming from because you distressed and you're completely thirsty and devoid of any elikuz, that propels you to a whole level of Helama Atzmi. Doesn't use that language here. Just want to clarify. But in the context of interface, this is an interesting interface in the interface itself, because in Torah itself, we find the concept of Mamat Lamaila and Torah Shebal Peh. We're going to talk about this a lot more when we compare the Mamat Lamaila of Tefillah and Mamat Lamaila of Torah. Of course, mitzvahs come into play because that's a combination of the two as well. Because on one hand, mitzvahs are below. We do them in this physical world, but they're Ratzon Elyon. So we'll get there. So in a way, you can talk about the neshama, talk about mitzvahs, Torah, tshuva, and then of course the combination of all of them together. Let's say Torah mitzvahs. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to continue the new paragraph on page 417, and now he's going back to answer the question that he began on page 402, and repeat it again on 409. And the question is, I'll just review the question again. What does ner mitzvah and Torah mean? It seems to imply that light comes from Torah, and mitzvah is the candle, but it's not lit yet. That's what he seemed to imply. And he said, how could you say that when we know, he said clearly, he said, these are the words he said. The mashma, the mitzvahs b'lei Torah, zeh k'mo haner b'lei oyer. Reading on page 402, that was the question. So even though there's shem and a psila, you have oil, fuel, and a wick, ain't it klum? It's nothing yet, because it's not been lit. So begam nikl ner ain't it klum lefi she'ein er Hashem meir bo. V'alei l'cheri yesh tira g'dei lezeh. How could it seems like there's a strong contradiction to saying that in the Kama Mekamis, where it says clearly that the ikar is Maisa. Maisa mitzvahs is the primary implementation of Torah, not Medrash. Dafka Maisa. Save Dover. It brings a whole bunch of verses. Save Maisa, Olam Machshavat Chila. The Nesave, Das Kolosim B'Seifon, all the things he brought here about Torah Shabbat Peh, he brought on mitzvahs. Ubezed Dafka Ikar Primis Atainug. To bring it down into action down below. And even Talmud is Mevil de Maisa. Why is Talmud great? Because it also brings you to action. Because Maisa is Etzem Harotzen, that's higher than reason, whereas Torah is reason, Chachma. Chachma is Torah, Rotzen is higher than Chachma. This is all the question. The Galgalta, the skull, that's higher than Chachma's Tamah. The Eich Omer, the Mitzvah Shenikon Ner, so how does he say in this pasuk, based on that explanation, mitzvah, that the mitzvah is called a candle and the Torah is called light? The ein er klal b'mitzvah b'lei er the Torah. From this is understood that the mitzvah without a Torah is not. There's no light. It's only a candle. Adrabah, hariya ikara er the atzmus ein sof is ba'atzmus haratzon in the mitzvah. This is the question he asked on page 402, 403. Now, we're not going to have to speculate because he's going to spell it out. I just wanted to go back to the very question. So then he went on to explain that of Torah is not just it's atzmi. It's from before the tzimtzum. But then on page 409, he said that's still not enough. Because at the end of the day, mitzvah is still rotzen elyon, and also mitzvah also has an element of the 620 pillars of light, tarach, 613 mitzvahs plus the 7 mitzvahs of the Rabbanon. Is the 620 pillars of light. That's what he said on page 409 when he said that you can't answer that, okay, Torah is because the atzmi, whereas mitzvahs is not. He says, you can't say that. And if you're going to speak that because atzmi ain't sof, that's higher than Ratzon Elyon. Also, the mitzvah shorshen be'er atzmi ain't sof v'nikla tarach hamudei. And to answer that, he said, let's now discuss the two levels of Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. And now, with all that we've learned, he's going to go back to answer the question. I just wanted to put it into context. So here goes the answer. We're learning inside, new paragraph, page 417. Pages can be found at ayimbeis.com. V'hine, and now, b'chol zeh, with all this, Yeturet Sakusha Dila'el. Will be the question above will be answered with all that we've just learned. The question in what it says, kiner mitzvah, that says ner mitzvah, that mitzvah is a candle. The mashma, from this it appears. Earlier he said mashma once he said move on. But it's the same. And mashma means it seems to be. Move on means it's understood. Not a contradiction. It's because it's a subtle difference. But he says the mashma from the fact that we call mitzvah ner, shebeloy er de teira ein nikra ner. That without teira it's not called a ner. What he means by that is it's not illuminated ner. That's why ner mitzvah v'teira. The mitzvah is like the candle. All the elements, what he called before the wick, and the oil, but it's not called eir until you have mitzvah. Hagam shamitzvah shoshim ba'asmus harotzen va'atainug hapashut. How could you say that? As we said earlier, the question that though mitzvahs are rooted in the core desire and pleasure of God, of atzmus, of the core rotzen v'atainug hapashut of God, as we learned earlier. So mitzvahs are not a small little thing. They're very rooted in the very core desire and pleasure. Like he said earlier on page 403, what did he say? He said, that's the level of Galgalta, the skull, which is higher than the superconscious Chachma, Stima, the hidden Chachma, because it's still Chachma. So yes, Torah is a high level of Chachma, but it's the Galgalta, the Ratzon, which does not have reason, because it's like Ratzon. Ratzon does not need logic and reason. So it's ultimately higher than Chachma Stima. That was part of the question. But now he says we're going to understand the answer. Why it's called Ner Mitzvah. But the light of Torah, Magia b'muchus v'atzmus erein sof mamish shalagai legam b'rotzen v'taineg haposh. So now he's saying, but after what we've learned about Torah, we come to a way that Torah is not just wisdom. Torah is not even just hidden wisdom. Talking about God's wisdom. Torah is going all the way, he says, reaches in the core essence of Erein Sof Mamish that's even higher than the Ratzon and Tainug, than the desire and the pleasure, HaPoshet Shebikeser. That is in Keser, Hanikra Tarach Hamud Eir. Remember, Tarach, 620, is also the letters Keser. It's still Keser. And remember, we learned that Keser is in the Shtalshlus. And Keser is subject to Helam. Remember, Sach, it's a pure light, a very refined light. But compared to the Ilos Ilos, the cause of causes, he said on the bottom of page 415 and earlier as well, it's Uchamhu. It's darkened. And even the highest levels of Ak are darkened. So it's true, it's a very high level. It's calling it Ratzon V'Taineg HaPashet of Keser, which is called the Tarach Hamud Eir, 620, pillars of light. But it's still, there's something higher, and that's Torah. Because the Torah there is Mechus V'Atzmus Erein Sof, that's even higher than Keser, higher than this Ratzon and Tainug. Why is that? V'hu Mishum the Oyer, the Torah, because the light of Torah does something that nothing else does. Megala Kol Helam V'Cheshach Canal. It reveals every darkness and every concealed secret, because it's completely beyond and transcends, defies darkness altogether. So therefore, that as we're going to explain, or he's going to say at least briefly, mitzvahs doesn't have that, because Torah is the atzmi. This is the closest thing possible to God expressing Himself. So even though mitzvahs are Ratzon Hashem, which is also God expressing, this is what I want, but you don't have the element of that revelation. And it's very clear he's talking here both Torah Shebiksav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, because clearly he needed both to explain this idea. But let's see, we'll read inside and see how much the Rebbe Rebbe says and see how much we need to explain. So Torah is Megala Kol Hem V'Cheshach Canal. That's its unique feature. That's why it's called Ur. And even further, Moyer, as he said. He didn't say that here, but we learned that earlier. V'Hamitzvos B'Asiyah Lamata. What sounds like he's saying, mitzvahs, on the other hand, are manifest in Asiyah Lamata. So it's true, they implement the desire and they're rooted in very high level, but the bottom line is a mitzvah itself is not a revealer of Eir Ein Sof. It's essentially God's will manifesting in Asiyah Lamata, B'dvarim Gashmim, in physical matters. Like the wool of tzitzis, the cloth of tefillin, and the parchment of tefillin, ukahai gavna. I know you may say, one second, doesn't a Sefer Torah also parchment? Yeah, but that's not the ikar of the Sefer Torah. That's just, it's put on paper, so we should read it. The ikar of Torah is this message, is the blueprint, is God's, as I said, source code. So mitzvahs are mislabish. In a sense, what he's saying, I don't know if I could say this 100% clearly, but it sounds to me, Torah is megala, even that which is hidden in mitzvahs. Because the mitzvah, when you just look at a mitzvah, let's say someone's putting on film, and someone's putting on tzitzis. So it's beautiful. I mean, they're fulfilling a mitzvah, but you don't see the godly message within it unless you learn Torah. Like, why are you doing this mitzvah? Why this mitzvah? What's the hamshacha, and so on and so forth. He's not saying it explicitly, but it sounds like he's saying that mitzvahs is primarily the action component. So though the action is the end of the process and necessary, and without it, the whole thing is not fulfilled, like we've been learning, mitzvahs actually implement Torah Sheba'al Peh. So if Torah Sheba'al Peh has the etzem, for sure mitzvahs do, but it's not in a revealed way. And Torah is a revealer. That's the key thing that he's emphasizing. If you look at the words, it says megala. Mitzvahs implement, but it's not megala. Well, let's see.
What does it mean? Lemailo gam rotzen v'tainog haposhut. Rotzen v'tainog haposhut.
I'm literally in the middle of teaching and explaining it. You're asking me exactly what I'm talking about right now. I just explained it. I just explained what he's saying here. One second. Let's continue reading. I'll stop for questions as soon as. Let me finish the subject. Let's see how he goes here. Well, gama esa mitzvah v'kavana. He goes back to what he spoke about. So therefore, even when you do a mitzvah with intention, and remember, intention is already a gili. It's not just an action. Kavana means you're thinking about the purpose of the mitzvah. You're thinking what the intention of the mitzvah is. If you will not have the light of Torah radiating in the mitzvahs, they don't yet have the revelation of the divine Ein Sof within them. Even though he performed the Ratzon Elyon, you fulfill the mitzvah, and you have kavanah in the mitzvah. The kavanah, let's say tzitzis, very isam that when you look at tzitzis, reminds you of all the tayyag mitzvahs, or tefillin reminds you of mitzvahs mitzvahs, whatever the kavanah may be. But if you don't have er Torah rating in it, you don't have igili Ein Sof atzmei adayin, even though the Ratzon Elyon was performed. In other words, you have the action, but you don't have the gili of Ein Sof within it. Lefisha ika gili Ein Sof u'ba'er hachachma de Torah, because the primary revelation of Ein Sof is in the light of the wisdom of Torah, dafka. Liyes b'chinas atzmis u'primis shalei mamish, because Torah is the mamish, the core and the inner. Shaloi means obviously of Hashem, like we learned from all the way before the Simpson, before anything. It's like we've said, etzlei omen or uman, but shashuim lefonov. It's very God's delights. It's God's closest thing to expressing God's reality. Ulakach gozru, amen. And that's why Chazal say, and they decreed, the Talmud Torah keneged kulam. We say Talmud Torah, learning Torah keneged kulam, keneged all the mitzvahs, keneged kulam, keneged kulam kol mitzvahs. All the mitzvahs, Talmud Torah corresponds to all of them. Is keneged, is as powerful as all of them, because Torah has this power, Torah er. Kechachme bereish. He's giving an example like wisdom in the mind, in the head, in the brain. Like we see when we talk about chachma, it's like chachma, even though they're all the limbs and organs of the body, but where is it all being? Who's drawing? Who is extending the chayis to all evarim? It comes from the moyach. And if you'd not have the central nervous system, or in general, the mind, the moyach of Chachmah, there'd be no er v'chayz, there'd be no energy and vitality in the limbs at all. So you see clearly. So the mitzvahs are compared to the limbs. Torah is compared to Chachmah, the er of Chachmah. And that's why you could say an er mitzvah without Torah is not er. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean it's not fulfilling the Ratzon Elyon, but you can't call it a revelation. I will explain what he's saying shortly. I just want to read and see what the Mittler Rebbe says, and then I'll explain what is the smile of Oir. What do we mean by that exactly? Because you could say, 1 second, person's putting on film. Why is that not a gili? Before he's putting on film, putting on film means he's binding his mind and his heart together. So it seems to be a gili. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let me first finish reading, because I said, let's read what he says, then we'll go. And remember, this is all based on everything we learned here about Torah Eir that can help us understand what mitzvahs don't have. So let's just continue reading inside. Even if you have some questions, don't process. Let's try to absorb, learn what he says, which is what I'm doing right now, and then see what we derive from it and what still needs explanation, if anything needs explanation. So this example is very applicable. All the mitzvahs, so too all the mitzvahs are called. The 248 mitzvahs correspond to called the Ramache Vorim. They're the 248 limbs. Vorim de Malko. The Torah, and just like with Chachma, you can have all the limbs, but if you don't have Chachma, you don't have the brain working, the limbs will not function. The Torah, ein b'hem gilia lekus atzmei. And without the Eir of Torah, you don't have the Gilia Lakus Atzmei, the very core Gilia of Elakus. You have the fulfillment of what Hashem wants. That, yes, he made that clear. You're Mekayim the mitzvah. He didn't say you're not Mekayim the mitzvah. But you don't have Gilia Lakus Atzmei. V'loi Omar v'chai behem v'chai hachayim. And when it says v'chai behem, and you shall live with them, which means with the mitzvahs, with vitality, and that comes from the life of life, the source of life. So you don't say that. Only with the interface of the light of Torah do you say this idea, that the mitzvahs are alive. Not just that you're doing them, but they come alive in with vitality and dynamic. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to read till the end of the paragraph and then explain. And that's why it says that loy amoretz chosid b'mitzvos. So the Mishnah says loy amoretz chosid. What's an amoretz? Someone who doesn't have Torah. Why can't you say he's a chosid? He's doing mitzvahs. Because if he still doesn't have Torah, there's something lacking. That's why he adds the word b'mitzvos. The Mishnah just says lo amoretz chosid. That amoretz can't be a chosid. He doesn't mean necessarily chassidim as we know them as chassidim of today. He means a chassid from the time of the Mishnah. But the same idea. So in other words, why? You're doing the mitzvahs. Why can't he be a chassid? He's a chassid in good deeds. Because to really have the mitzvahs alive, what he calls a chassid, you need to have Torah. This actually, I believe, is an expression from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, where he says that clearly. And I think we need Alter Rebbe's Maimer to help us understand this as well. So it doesn't hurt to look. I just want to look inside. 1 second. I'm almost sure he says it here. Yeah. Yeah, if you look at the Alter Rebbe's Maimon, I think we're going to learn it inside because it's going to help us understand the Mittler Rebbe here. He says, he actually brings it here. Interesting. Here he brings Ein Neshama B'lei Mitzvah Kalei Amoretz Chosid. B'lei Bur Yerichet. V'gam Mitzvah B'lei Neshama Ein Klum Ki Kol Ha'emer Ein Li Ala Teira Afil Teira Ein Le. Here he says Mitzvah without Neshama is nothing, because anyone who says I have only Teira, even Teira they don't have, which means Teira. Okay, we'll read that later. Just want to remember that he brought Le'amoretz Chosid. The context here is that you need to have not just mitzvah but Torah Eir. So Amoretz is not going to have the Chosid of mitzvahs without Torah. The kol zeh, and all this, says the Mittler Rebbe, is bechachma de Torah sheba'al peh. So here he's adding. Because till here he didn't say, is he talking about the written Torah or oral Torah? He just said Torah Ed. Now he's clearly saying that all this is with the wisdom of Torah sheba'al peh. Means addition, not just Torah shebiksav, but also Torah sheba'al peh. He doesn't mean Torah sheba'al peh and not Torah shebiksav. But it looks like Torah sheba'al peh plays a critical role here. Even though when we say Torah Ed, we mean both. But he clearly says, b'chachma Torah sheba'al peh, shemavarer, like we learned, l'cheshech hagas de klipas nega. So I may correct myself by saying the following: that Torah Eir, you may not be able to say is higher than mitzvahs, but Torah sheba'al peh for sure, because it's mevarer, it clarifies and separates and refines the cheshech, the thick and gross and crass darkness of klipas nega, of the husks in this world. As we learned, sharsha, this birur of Torah sheba'al peh, sharsha l'mayla yesher ba'atzmis hamoyer de ein sof. Its root is higher in the core moyer of ein sof, shemeir be'er de chachma de Torah, which radiates in the eir of chachma of Torah. In other words, Torah shebiksav is the eir. This power of Torah sheba'al peh goes back all the way to the shadish of the moyer.
Why?
The fisha nos chilosim b'seifon dafke, like we learned, because the beginning is wedged in the end. Shazeu ikar er de Torah. That is the primary light of Torah. Shemeir b'ner mitzvah. Correct, because even though the mitzvahs come from Torah shebiksav, but knowing how to do a mitzvah, you must have Torah sheba'al peh. So the ikar of Torah that radiates in mitzvahs, in their mitzvah, the protis, in the details, to know how to do the mitzvah, to transform the thick, the crass darkness that we mentioned before. So this really, that's why it was critical to explain Torah sheba'al peh, what he's saying. Because with Torah shebiksav, he said earlier, you could still say, 1 second, Torah is eir, but so is mitzvahs. Tarach amudei eir. But once you get to Torah sheba'al peh, you're getting back to the moed, and the real kavanah is to bring it into this world. So then, the way the mitzvahs have that power to do so, it must have Torah sheba'al peh. In other words, Torah shebiksav radiates tremendous amount of intense light from before the tzimtzum. But Torah sheba'al peh is what really draws from the deepest level to implement it. So even if you were to say that a mitzvah has a mile over Torah because it implements Torah in the physical world, Torah is not like a physical mitzvah like tefillin or tzitzis, but Torah sheba'al peh is the root of the mitzvahs, because it's the only way to know how to do a mitzvah in this world and use a mitzvah to transform the world is through Torah sheba'al peh, and Torah sheba'al peh radiates. The mitzvah is only the action, but Torah sheba'al peh is the actual illumination of what God wants with all its detail, like we learn in Torah sheba'al peh. We learn it's a full, complex, and comprehensive understanding of Torah shebiksav that allows us to do the mitzvahs. That's what he's saying here. V'zeu she'amar, the Talmud dafke maybe l'dei ma'aseh, and that's what it says. Dafke Talmud brings to ma'aseh. Earlier, he used this statement to say that even Talmud, the ikar is that it brings to ma'aseh. Now he's emphasizing the other way around. Why is Taka Talmud gadol? Because without Talmud, you can't come to ma'aseh. If you don't know, if you don't learn, how are you going to know what to do? So the answer is because Talmud, and especially Talmud, like he's saying, Torah sheba'al peh is what brings you to action. So essentially what he's saying here, the way I'm breaking it down, Torah shebiksav is the blueprint. Er atzmi, from before the tzimtzum, it has all that power. It's not, it defies and is beyond the tzimtzum, but it's a blueprint. Torah sheba'al peh is the building, the actual implementation into a working document that you now can go ahead and know how to build, in this case, how to do a mitzvah. And the mitzvah is the actual implementation. So in that context, the mitzvah is definitely, of course, power as Ratzon Elyon. Not only that, is Tarach Amudei Eir from Keser, like he said. It's a Ratzon and Tainug Atzmi, but it doesn't have Eir. It's only action-based. Even the kavanah, he says, is not really the oir of Torah. Now, a simple explanation for that, I go back to the sikha that I've mentioned a number of times, Echelik Tazayin, the beautiful sikha Vayakel, the Rebbe made a siyum Masechta Chagiga, and there's two parts to it. One part is the Nigla, is in the Truma sikha, and Vayakel is the Chassidus of it. And there he speaks about this idea of Talmud HaMaisa, or in the context of Torah and Mitzvahs. Or sometimes, there he doesn't talk about Yehuda and Yosef, but sometimes Yehuda is Maisa, Godel, Maisa, and Yosef is Talmud. So what is the real difference between action and learning Torah? So let me explain it based on that sikha and based on a few other sikhas, and I think it will help us understand what he's saying here. And then, of course, I'll stop for any questions. So basically, using the expression, using, first of all, the explanation of Chassidus, that Atzmus created existence using Oyer. Oyer is his tool, so to speak. I always refer to it as field of energy. But Atzmus itself is built in Metzias. Nimtza is a non-existential reality beyond existence altogether. The Eibishter wanted an existence like ours, so he manifested from Atzmus into a field of energy, what we call Metzias Nimtza Oyer. All it is like the light of the sun. It's a way of expressing sunlight to outside of the sun. So it is really God's way of expression. Think of it like a infinite, shapeless, and seamless field of energy. You can call it like a quilt, where everything will flow from there. So whatever is going to be created, even the yesh, which is rooted in Atzmus, the yesh hanivra, which is rooted higher than Oyer, is also created through Oyer. Oyer is like, think of it, I don't want to use this example because it's really the kav, but think of like an artist. Whatever he paints on the canvas is all coming through his paintbrush. Even the things the paintbrush itself doesn't have, but the paintbrush is the way that he expresses it. So Torah Oyer is the way that everything that comes from Hashem is going to go through Torah Oyer. That's why Stako Baraisa Bar Alma, God looks into the Torah and creates the world. Torah is his blueprint. Everything comes through Torah. Even mitzvahs. How do you know how to do mitzvahs? You learn Torah. Even tshuva. We learned about tshuva being higher than Torah. That's why tshuva can repair even when someone unfortunately transgresses Torah. It also, Torah teaches us about tshuva. Even Mesiras Nefesh. How do we know about Mesiras Nefesh? Even though it's higher than Torah, Torah again reveals it to us. Neshamas. Neshamas have an aspect that's higher than Torah. But again, the Torah teaches us about Neshama, because the Torah, everything goes through Oyer. You may recall we learned about Kalim. Kalim are rooted higher than Oyer. They're rooted in the Rishimu, in that trace that's rooted all the way in the Helam Ha'atzmi. Helam Ha'atzmi is higher than Oyer. And even that goes through Oyer. Oyer also ultimately carries. Basically, Oyer is the carrier of everything. So bottom line is, even when you say that Shuvah is higher than a tzaddik, even when you say a mitzvah has something that Torah doesn't have, that also comes through Torah. So Torah is a revealer. It's a revealer of God's will, a revealer of God's wisdom. It's a revealer that God doesn't just want us to be action-based servants, that we're just following orders and fulfilling. He wants us to understand God. He wants us to understand Him. He wants us to feel Him. Imagine a relationship in a marriage. It was only based on actions. You do what your wife tells you, she does what you tell her, and that's it. There's no communication. There's no understanding of each other. There's no dialogue. There's no discussion. That would be mitzvahs without Torah. Torah is an illuminator. Torah creates a relationship. We receive the Torah. We learn Torah. We ask questions. We probe. We argue. We evaluate. And especially Torah Shabbat Peh, of course. And trying to understand, what does God really want of us? That's not a servant that's just action-based. A servant just has to do. You don't have to understand anything. You master the king tells you an order, you have to implement it. But that's not what Hashem wanted. He wanted us to have a relationship with Him. That's why there's a whole Seder Ishtalshalos. That's why you have Oyer in the first place. It's Gili Elikus, not just Elikus, not just the Etzem of Elikus. So as much as a mitzvah reveals Etzem, you need to have this Gili. That's one point. Another point. There's a sikha from the Rebbe, which I've mentioned many times. It's in Chelik Chelik Chav Hey, by Yigash. Where a question is asked, it says Talmud and Maisa. Which is greater, study or action? Or Maisa, the action. So the Gemara says, Talmud Gadol Shemeva the Maisa. It has both. Because it has learning and brings to action. Whereas action only has action, doesn't have Talmud. So the whole discussion about Yosef and Yehuda, why Yosef had to be a leader before Yehuda, like Mashiach ben Yosef before Mashiach ben David. So the question is asked, it says in Svarim, that the Shmuel, many places, that Mashiach will come, Maisa Gadol, the halacha will change. Today, Talmud Gadol, because Talmud Gadol maybe the Maisa. But Mashiach comes, will be Maisa Gadol. Action will be greater than study. So the Klotz Kasha, what does that mean? Talmud has both. Even when Mashiach comes, it has both. So why suddenly action will be greater than study? And the Rebbe, there was an answer in the Sikha that what they prepared from the Rebbe's earlier talks. When that was sent into the Rebbe added in his own handwriting a completely new answer. And it's simple but brilliant. And the Rebbe says like this: why do we need to study Torah? Why can't we just do mitzvahs? Why can't we instinctively do mitzvahs? The answer is because we live in a world of hell and behester. And instinctively, we don't know which mitzvah to do. When it comes to human hunger, for example, or thirst, you don't need to look in Shulchan Aruch or in Torah or Talmud to know that you're hungry or to know how to eat. You may need to tell you what is healthy or not, but I mean to say, the body itself tells you when you're hungry, when you're tired, and all other needs that you have. But the Eibishter made a big tzimtzum that Ruchni is, the neshama does not feel when it's hungry. I mean, it does feel to a certain extent, but not quite. You wake up in the morning, you'll feel physical hunger. You may not feel spiritual hunger. So how do you know what to do? How then do you know what to do? So that's why we have a Talmud. We have Talmud. We learn. The Torah tells us you wake up in the morning, you say Moedani, you daven, and you learn, you do mitzvahs, all the things the Torah tells us what to do. Talmud is illuminating, even though the bottom line is action, but you don't know what the action to do and how to do the action and the details. That's today. When Mashiach comes, the world will be so saturated and so refined with godliness that it will become just like the physical body today. The world itself will tell you what is godly. And the Rebbe brings a medrash that says that a Shemitah or Shabbos, when Mashiach comes, and someone will want to take a fig off a fig tree, the fig itself will cry out, it's Shabbos today, or Shemitah. There's two different ways to nuschayis. Because me'even mekir tizak, the stones themselves will cry out because they'll be so godly. Just like your body today tells you you're hungry, your soul will tell you that you need this and this mitzvah. Instinctively, naturally, because there's no longer the Helen. So therefore you don't need the Talmud to teach you that. Come Shabbos, you don't need to open a Shulchan Aruch to know what to do, what not to do. Your naturals in the Neshama will know. So why then will we learn Torah when Mashiach comes? So the Rebbe brings from Ageres HaKedesh, in Simach Chavav, where he says, then Torah will be for Yechudim Elyenim, in order to connect deeper and deeper to godliness. Because remember, Torah, at the end of the day, like we said, Eirei Ein Sof reflects. But what do you see from this? This is very similar to what we learned in Nayim Beis, that the Eir HaRiyah, today, our eye cannot see on its own in a dark room. Even though the very eye sees, it's not the light that shines. And when it shines a light, who's seeing the object? The eye. But you need the light to illuminate. And then the eye sees. When Mashiach comes, we learned, we'll reach the Etzem Koyach HaRiyah, and we'll be able to see even in the dark and see even distances that today we cannot see over far distances. So the point is that the Etzem lies in Maisin Tachtenim, in the lowest action. But Torah is the illuminator, both, number one, everything goes through Eir, and number two, it is the illuminator that illuminates and allows us to have the full experience, like I said, experience, not just to do what God wants. And finally, like I'm just explaining now, especially now, Torah illuminates how to do a mitzvah and what to do in a mitzvah. So all of that can help explain what he's saying here. That's why ultimately, Ner mitzvah, yeah, it's a candle, but it's not Eir without Torah. Torah is what brings the Eir aspect. Not the Ratzon, not the action and not the implementation, but the illumination, the revelation, the Giluyim that come from that. Okay. And with that, we conclude this paragraph.
Can you take any questions?
So
I'll be happy to take questions. I just want to, if you give me a moment, just give me a moment because just a moment, please. Yeah, go ahead. Any questions, right?
So my question is, how do you reconcile everything you just said with what it says in Tanya, where he talks about doing a mitzvah with proper kavana? He talks about kavana is the neshama of the mitzvah, and if you do the mitzvah not just out of love and fear of God, but rather out of understanding that you're mamash bringing elokus into the world by doing the mitzvah, basically the moiching of the kavana. You know this. I don't have to tell you that you're bringing in godliness into the world that way, and that's a mirror. So and then let's take for example women doing mitzvahs. I mean, women generally don't study Gemara, the Torah Shabbat Peh, but nevertheless, they're still doing mitzvahs. They're still part of the Bureau of the world and helping make this world a dira. And it just seems like.
Well, what are you suggesting? That you don't need Torah, you only need mitzvahs?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying once you learn
the same Tanya talks both sides. If you go into if you look in Tanya, you'll find the emphasis is on Maisa, and then the emphasis on the Shama, the Kavanah, and it talks at length as well as what Torah accomplishes. So they're all needed. It's all needed here. I don't see any contradiction at all.
Oh, I didn't say contradiction. One of the implications of what you said today, and it was largely a lecture today, which is fine. It was wonderful, but that it's really not accomplishing the purpose of the Bria just to do the mitzvah alone. Even with Kavanah.
I'm only reading what he said. I'm only reading what he says. He says the ner mitzvah below the Torah ain't a nikra ner. I'm just explaining what he's saying here. You need both.
Yeah.
He didn't say here you don't need mitzvahs. He's explaining why Torah is called and a mitzvah is not called That's the main thing that we discussed.
All right, but
it's not a discussion about the importance of mitzvahs. He said mitzvahs is rotzen and tainagalion, but Torah, especially Torah Shabbat Peh, goes all the way to the moyer and brings the and I just explained what that means in the way I understand.
So, right, I wasn't suggesting.
So I'm not sure what the question is.
Just take ganache. People that do mitzvahs that are not learned in Torah. I mean, they're still
there are people. Look in the Daled Minim. This is not a judgment about people. The Daled Minim that we take on Sukkos. There's 4 types. That says the esrig is Torah and mitzvahs. The lulav is Torah without mitzvahs. The dasim is mitzvahs without Torah, and the arov is no mitzvahs and no Torah. There are people who don't do either. They're beautiful souls, especially with Tinik Shanish. But this is not a discussion now of reward and value. This is talking about what God wants. He gave us Torah and mitzvahs. And he said in the pasuk, Ner mitzvah and Torah The Mitzvah Rebbe is explaining why is he saying Ner mitzvah and why does he say by Torah which suggests that a mitzvah without Torah doesn't have And that's what we're learning here. It's not a question of the fact that if someone actually ends up being an Amoritz, let's say, he says, La Amoritz Chassid. he doesn't learn Torah, but he does a mitzvah. No one's taking away from any of the value. Is it complete? Listen, it's not. It would be more complete if he learned Torah, but this is not a question of judgment or depending also on his circumstances. Especially if a person, let's say, never had the opportunity to learn Torah. You have stories of the Baal Shem Tov, stories today. People never went to yeshiva and so on, but yet their sincerity in doing a mitzvah can reach the deepest levels. But he was talking about the whole picture. The pasuk says ner mitzvah v'Torah. And we know that we need both Torah and mitzvahs. That's what he's really saying here.
Right. No, I see that. I'm not saying he's prioritizing one or the other, although it does seem to be prioritizing Torah over mitzvahs.
He's explaining why it says Torah and their mitzvah. That's the whole thing. Lies in that
right.
verse.
But when you look at the other pasuk, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, we talked about how the neshama is the or.
Okay, I'm not. So what do you telling me that Torah is not Ur?
No,
the pasuk says
not.
Torah. By the neshama, it only says Ner. It doesn't say Ur.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point. That's the whole thing here. That Torah, Dafka Torah is Ur.
I thought
this
we said
is
that
this is the whole theme of the Maimer in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and Ayin Beis.
Mm-hmm.
I do have to run in a minute. Any other questions?
Yes. From here is much more as that the Torah is the thing that is giving the whole highest in the mitzvahs. And that's why the Torah is above the AdHamtz Bereishis Vitalizing Mitzvos. Does that mean that the Torah is creating the Rotzen on the Tainug?
Creating? You said creating the Ratzon and Tainug?
Yeah, because the Torah is coming
he doesn't use. Why would you use that word? He doesn't use the word creating. He says, mitzvahs manifest the Ratzon and Tainug, and there's something higher than Ratzon and Tainug, and that's what it says. Ein Sof Atzmim Husva Atzmus Ein Sof Mamish, or what he says afterwards, the Moyer Mamish.
Okay, so why can't we say because this is making it should be a Ratzon?
I don't say why would you say it's making it? Why, he's not talking about creating Ratzon and Tainug. He's talking about the each level as it is.
I hear what Rabbi Teichel is saying is Torah explains why doing a mitzvah gives the is Tainug to the Eibishter and is the Ratzon of the Eibishter. So Torah is essentially the source or explains why it's Tainug and Ratzon. I think that's what I hear, Rabbi.
I don't know if that's correct even.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what he's saying here even. But is that
correct?
So what's the question? So what's the question?
No, I just want to hear what you say about it because this gives an explanation why
he doesn't say it, and I don't see why you say it on the creation of the world. You say God looked into the Torah and He created the world. I wouldn't say He looked into the Torah and He created the Ratzon and Tainug. Doesn't sound right.
We know always that Aliyas Eilamis, Aliyas Horotzin, that the world Rotzin. So
I'm talking about the Ratzon for Torah, the Ratzon and Tainug of mitzvahs.
You know what I mean?
The Ratzon and Tainug of mitzvahs is a Ratzon Atzmi and a Tainug Atzmi. It goes hand in hand with Torah. Torah and mitzvahs go hand in hand. So he's talking here. We're talking about the two aspects.
Is higher.
But it doesn't. You say, but he doesn't. Okay, I don't. To me, the question does not register to me. It says God looked into the Torah and created the world. To say He looked into the Torah and created mitzvahs, created Ratzon and Tainug, it doesn't sound right. He doesn't say
He
it.
said
I don't see any reason why he would say it. Bottom line is he doesn't say it. If you have a good reason, fine. I don't personally see a need to explain why, but if you want to think about it, he doesn't say that because I don't think it's correct.
I'm trying to understand. Ratzon V'Tainug HaPashut is a very, very high source, and he said that the
So what's that? Are you
is
saying
even
so?
higher,
Everything. Okay. Look, I tried to explain it to the best of my ability. I don't know what more I can say. I explained at length, I think, what means Torah, what means mitzvahs, action, and so on. If it needs more explanation, I'm happy to hear what questions there are. I'm not clear what we all know it's a very high level. That's not the question here. The question is there something higher than it? And it clearly says Torah, especially Torah Shabbat Peh, is.
He said,
Right.
I mean, why not? On a very balabad, I just gave a whole discussion on Talmud and Maisa. The Gemara asks, which is greater, Talmud or Maisa? And the Gemara answers, Talmud Gadol Shemevel De Maisa. That doesn't mean Maisa is not a very high level. It just is that Talmud is Gadol Shemevel De Maisa. I just explained that's part of this whole discussion.
I don't think we're coming to say you didn't explain the Mitzvah, Rebbe. Well, we're trying to reconcile it with other Torah. For example, neshamos, before they come into the world, are higher than Torah. Now, once they come in the goof, it's not necessarily so. But you could say, where's the or of the mitzvah without Torah? It's the neshama. We learned that, and that's why both Rabbi Teichel and I are trying to reconcile.
So you know what? Since I have to go right now, so you can discuss it and maybe figure out more, by all means, and we'll continue tomorrow.
Reb Simon, also you said that tshuva is higher than Torah. Could you give some more OCS to explain?
Not right now.
We'll do that.
We'll do that tomorrow, and you could look it up in Ayin Beis. He talks about it in volume 3, and we'll continue tomorrow. I have to run right now. I have something important happening right now. So we'll stop here. The end of the paragraph on page 400.